Party with your host, Dustin Rybka.
Hello and welcome to Sex Party. I'm your host, Dustin Rybka. This is episode 35. Wow. Episode 35, my guest this week, Mia Davis. Mia is the founder of Taboo, a sexual health and wellness company. She's also the host of a great podcast, Asking for Myself, sex, relationships, you name it. She's talking about it in a way that I think is really unique and cool. We talk about her podcast on the show. We talk about what it's like to have a sex and dating relationships podcast, what that's like. We talk about how Hollywood movies get sex all wrong. I share one personal thing that I haven't talked about on the show. Actually, in this episode, I talk a lot about things I haven't talked about on the show before. And it's a really great episode. I had a really great back and forth with Mia. I love what she's doing with her company. I love what she's doing with her podcast. So, ready? Without further ado, this is my conversation with Mia Davis.
This week's conversation.
Mia Davis, welcome to Sex Party. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, of course. I'm excited to have you. But those people that may be in the audience who don't know who you are, listening, watching on YouTube, wherever they are, we say hello to them, but wherever they are, can you talk to them a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Mia Davis, full name, and I'm the founder and creator of Taboo, which is an educational platform about sexual wellness and relationships, mental health, really just opening up conversations and having community around these really important topics that many people are embarrassed to talk about. And then I'm also the host of Asking for Myself, which is a podcast about all those same topics. And yeah, I'm really excited to chat with you today.
Yeah, it'll be fun, I promise. If it's not, then you can just trash me afterwards. But no, so with Taboo, you started this company. When did you start it? And I guess just to make your life more difficult, why did you start it?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I started it about 6 years ago, so 2016. And I really started it, I think I didn't realize even at the time why I started it. So at the time, I was living in San Francisco, Silicon Valley, and working at a tech company as a product designer. And my entire life, I grew up really conservative in the Midwest, going to like a religious school. And so I had a lot of shame around sex, and I had negative experiences. I had experienced some sexual trauma when I was in college. And I think that, just basically me and my friends were talking about like how sex in movies is so unrealistic. You don't see any of the awkward moments. It's just so like, it goes from 0 to 100, real quick. And there's no conversations, nothing. And I just got really latched onto the idea and got hooked on this concept of kind of like, how do we make sex more approachable? How do we talk about the awkward moments? How do we just make it, fun and talk about pleasure and what it should be instead of all of the shame and, stigma associated with sex? And I think I latched onto it in retrospect, largely because of my own upbringing and sort of the feelings that I had growing up and wanting to create a safe space for others so they would not repeat my mistakes and not hopefully fall into some of the same, situations that I did. So that was really, I guess I created it kind of for my younger self. And then as it's evolved with me, and it's evolved with like, me getting older and kind of having different experiences and trying to, empathize and create resources for people going through some of the same things.
Yeah. I mean, that's how you fight back, right? To me, that's what that sounds like is like a way to be rebellious and kind of push back against these like horrible ideas that, whomever is like cramming down our throats. And I love that. And I congratulate you on that, 'cause that's fucking rad.
Thank you.
And also like, sorry to hear that you had to go through trauma. That always fucking sucks. I can't imagine, and I hear about that on the show quite a bit. And it's just like, it's terrible to hear that. So sorry to hear that.
Thank you.
You said you created it so that people wouldn't make the same mistakes as you. So could you talk about maybe some of what those mistakes were?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I guess that, I try to be easy on myself and like not be too hard on myself for some of the things that I did. But even I would say, I guess, I don't know if some of them are like mistakes, but just like the ignorance that I had, the unknowns that I had. So even relating to like my period, for example, I always struggled with my period. I didn't know how to use a tampon, like things like this. And I didn't really feel comfortable getting help or asking for help or like talking to anybody about what I was going through. And then with the trauma that I experienced, I would say like after the fact, I was really struggling with like my body and just having sex. And so some of the things that I would do is like turning to alcohol, for example, to try to like numb myself or just kind of like not be present or whatever. And I would say, looking back, of course, I can be compassionate to myself and know that I didn't even know what I was going through. But I would say, obviously, if I could like reach back into time, just saying, this is not helping. It's actually making things much worse. And, you probably need to, like talk to someone and kind of work through this. So I would say the mistakes that I made were just kind of like trying to solve my own problems and not talking about them and not asking for help and kind of turning to relationships or boyfriends to kind of make up for the gap in me not knowing about sex even, and like just leaving it up to them to figure out what that should look like and not taking it upon myself.
Yeah, I mean, because it sounds like these things clearly obviously had an effect on you, but you didn't, there wasn't a point where you're like, oh, to me it sounds like you're sort of like, I refuse to believe that sex is bad or wrong or gross or evil or fucked up or whatever, and you needed to find a way to comprehend it on your terms and make it available and safe and fun and whatever else for you. So it sounds like that was your way of doing that.
Yeah, definitely. I think so. I think I always knew that. I mean, growing up in a super like in a religious environment and knowing, being taught to like obviously wait, be abstinent, these kinds of things, I knew that I was like a sexually curious person from a young age. And I knew that that was like, or it felt like it was wrong. Um, and so, yes, I definitely had to like work on reconciling that and knowing and pushing back against it and knowing, like, I know this is normal and I know that I have natural desires. So how do I work through that and be like, yeah, like how do you maintain your values or like adapt your values or whatever? And yeah, that's definitely been like a journey and it's ongoing, but I definitely had to fight back against quite a lot of indoctrination, I guess, and societal pressures and whatever.
Yeah, I mean, that seems to be the damage from that stuff, and we've had previous guests on the show that like when you crack into it, it's like, wow, there's so much more damage here than, and
Yeah.
it's sort of like you can see it in everything, advertising, it's just everywhere, and it's really, it's poisonous and scary, and so that's a huge factor. Okay, so you start Taboo to push back against that. Why the name Taboo?
I guess just kind of flipping it on its head and kind of, embracing that sex is quote unquote taboo to talk about, but it shouldn't be. So, yeah, taboo.
Yeah, and this other idea that comes up or has been coming up quite a bit lately on this show that you're on right now is this idea that that's by design, that people are made to feel gross about sex. And like, it's a little conspiracy theory almost ish that I'm sort of playing with, but fuck it. Like, it's fun. Like, let's go for it. But do you think that, that's just like a system that a bunch of like, old bearded dudes like put in place to like keep people down, and it's still going? Or do you think it's like actively being replenished? Like, we need to keep people not having orgasms, anxiety ridden, hooked on fucking booze, like, or whatever the hell this shit is. But
Yeah. Do I think that people are actively trying to prevent the majority, or specifically like, yeah, a lot of people in society, that they want people to feel shame with sex? Then there's some like, it's for some gain. Is that what you're asking?
yeah.
Yeah, it's so funny because I ask questions like that all the time. Like, do we think people are, consciously evil? Do we think people are consciously doing things that are harmful to other people? Or do people just kind of take advantage of situations and it's human nature to just do what benefits you? I don't know. It's hard because I would like to believe that people are just human, and there are, like inherent qualities of being human that lead us to doing things that harm other people, instead of sitting in a room and actively being like, this is what we're going to do in order to like, stifle women, and in order to like prevent women from feeling empowered and to make people feel shame about themselves. But do I think there are people who are, I do think people are smart enough in many instances to know what they're doing. And I definitely think that, like, for example, religious institutions, I think some of the leadership, do I think that they set out to do it in the way that it has been? I don't know. But do I think that they realize the consequences and either don't care or they like the consequences, so they continue to enforce certain things? Yes, most likely. Just because also, and if they don't, like, people have made it very apparent and they're not changing it, right? So it's like you are aware to some extent and you're not doing anything about it. So at that point, you're complicit, even if it wasn't your intention.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much there that we could like really fucking rabbit hole this whole interview. But yeah, I mean, bottom line, I think that people in power have always been afraid, and are always going to be afraid of like a bunch of pleasure filled, turned on people who know how to get the things that they need without those people. So to me, that's the ultimate weapon, is your own self-awareness, pleasure, fucking orgasms. Like, I think there's a lot of stuff that was introduced into the culture that's like, kind of fucking nasty on purpose. So, and I think whether we're still doing it, right, or we're doing it differently with our friend the internet. Either way, I just feel like it's still happening. So I'm aligned with you on all of that, and it's you put it in such an amazing way. So thank you for that answer. When you were talking about growing up and like your sexual experiences, I don't want to say awakenings, but that's sort of like where we're headed with this, whatever. You talked about like how movie sex just sucks, right? And it's like really unrealistic. Can you name a particular movie that were like, that's just garbage? Like, what is going on?
Oh, that's a good question. I think it's like so many that I watched growing up. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
even if it's not the sex scenes, it's definitely the way relationships are portrayed as well, where there's just a lot of unhealthy patterns going on. But as far as like a sex scene, it's funny because I also feel like nowadays I am starting to see better depictions. So newer shows seem to be doing a much better job. Or maybe it's just the shows I'm watching, like, Sex Education, or I mean, well, that's an obvious one, I guess, in terms of
Sure.
that's kind of the goal of the show. But I think there's other ones as well. But I don't know. I'm trying to think of like, I can kind of picture people just coming back from I feel like that happens in so many movies. I mean, is it like How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days, or I mean, it's probably literally any movie I could name. Where they're just like coming back from the date and then they're just like in the, it's literally like that scene where they come back, they walk through the door and then they're like up against the wall banging, like just that until they get to the bed. And then they get to the bed and then they usually wake up, right? Or like you don't even see the in between unless it's meant to be funny.
Right.
But otherwise it's kind of just like, yeah, bam, bam, bam. And then, oh my
Yeah.
gosh, amazing.
Like, oh my God, like they're laying in bed, like it's all over with. And it's like, what
And it's
happened to
always the exact like tucked, blanket that no one would ever have exactly like
Right.
that. Yeah.
Right. And like the to-go food is missing. Like, what happened with that? Yeah, there's so much of that in movies, and it's funny because when you're young, well, at least when I grew up in the dark ages, like we didn't have access to porn and these things as much as we do now, and so that's sort of in the beginning, right? That's sort of where we were getting our sex stuff from. It's like, oh, this movie has this scene, and like you somehow trick your parents into renting this thing. It's it's an action movie, I swear. Like, and so a lot of that stuff would happen and you would rewind it and watch it, whatever, but it was all so unrealistic. And it's crazy that you mentioned that early on in this conversation, because it really does drill in there and leave an impression when you're young and you see people that are like, it's just supposed to be so easy. And I think now, it's an interesting point. But like now I feel like there isn't much sex in big like on-screen movies. It's like they kind of like, if you really think about it, I think there was like one Marvel movie where like made out shirtless or something, and that was it. But like there really isn't, even in some of the like the crazier movies that are out and they're darker and all this stuff. There's like one every couple of years. It's like, oh my God. But there's nothing which is really interesting to me, that Hollywood would not be doing graphic sex scenes.
I feel like that now that I'm thinking about it, I mean, I can see what you're saying as far as movies. I do think that TV shows seem to be getting more graphic. Or maybe again, like it's because of what I'm watching, like HBO shows or like even Insecure or obviously like the new Sex in the City does definitely have like a pretty graphic sex scene. And maybe that's just because it's HBO and maybe HBO was always like that. I don't really know. Even actually like the new Gossip Girl, they've been having a lot of sex scenes, which is kind of weird in the sense that they're supposed to be teenagers, but then it's also on HBO. So it's like, are teenagers watching this? Is this for adults? Kind of weird.
Right.
Even though obviously I am watching it. But yeah, I feel like in TV shows it is happening, but maybe in movies it's not.
Yeah, well, basically that's like those are HBO teenagers. HBO like is like, fuck around and find out. HBO, we're HBO, like they've been doing that for decades, and I think that's fucking great. There's like, that's all sorts of incest happening on HBO constantly. There's all sorts of like wild threesome. I mean, Euphoria is on HBO.
It is, but wait, Netflix. I think Netflix is introducing. Have you seen actually the show? What is it called? It's literally called like Sex. Oh my God, it's literally called. Oh my gosh, what is? I'm actually having to look it up because
Yeah.
it's it was so bad. Sex Life. Sex Life.
I haven't.
Oh, that definitely. I mean, that's really definitely like all about. It's about this woman who, of course, I say it's bad, but I totally was obsessed with it. And it's about this woman who has this like wonderful husband who's
God.
super in love with her and honestly like very caring and trying to like fulfill her needs. But then she has, of course, this like toxic ex who she has this passion with. And, she's kind of like going between these two guys that are obsessed with her for whatever reason. And she has, her pick. And it's, just kind of this, it's a very it's a good, I mean, it's definitely, I would say, an arousing show.
It sounds like real life to me, actually, because I feel like that's really real, that someone would kind of get everything they want in a partner, and then they would be like, oh, now I kind of want this raunchy fucking bad boy dude or whatever. Like, that just sounds so real to me.
It does sound real, but I don't know that it plays out in real life. I feel like it's a fantasy. I mean, it is kind of a fantasy. I definitely think it happens where, and that's kind of what they explore, where she wanted to be a mom and she kind of found herself in this very stable life that she's now a little bit bored with. And I definitely could see how that would happen to a lot of people. But the fantasy is where I don't know how many people are having these like amazing options where they just get to. Maybe though, that sounds like it, it definitely is.
Yeah,
She has a good experience, I would say.
I think it depends on your your online dating game. Like you could totally
Okay.
if you're like a Bumble master, you could totally pull that off. I feel like, yeah, you could get a little. I mean, people, I think, nowadays just get sort of like caught in the big wheel of confusion. There's so much stuff happening that no one's like, well, I didn't know there was an app for sex parties or all of these other things. And I think that people do want specific sexual things, and I think now we're starting to like warm to the idea of, oh, maybe I could get those things. And your podcast, which I'm segueing into now, right, is a podcast that's talking about all of the sexual stuff, relationship stuff. So people hear people like you and they're like, huh. Because I've talked to so many people around my podcast and they're like, I've had ideas, I've had thoughts, I've had whatever. And I'm like, oh shit. And like hearing it on your show has made me think maybe I should go. And I'm like, this is awesome. So with that wonderfully executed segue on my part.
Look at that. Beautiful art.
Welcome to podcasting, guys. Could you talk about the title of your podcast, right? You mentioned earlier, but what you're talking about on the show and why you're doing it, because I think it's awesome.
Yeah, thank you so much. For sure. So asking for myself, I guess, similar to Taboo, is kind of supposed to be a play on words. And, of course we will say, hey, what would you do if, or like, what would this be? Asking for a friend, like, I'm not really, this isn't about me. Let me paint this entire scenario, but it's about a friend. So I think that was kind of the idea where it's, like remove the shame, remove any embarrassment of asking real questions for yourself. And then me as the host kind of like taking that on for you. So if you're not comfortable asking for yourself, like I'll ask for myself. I'll take the position of the listener and ask all of these questions that either I've always wanted to know or our community's always wanted to know, and tapping on, some amazing experts in the field, whether that's therapists, sex educators, coaches, and then also people with lived experience, which I think is really important. I mean, obviously every therapist or professional has lived experience as well, but they also have that lens from a professional perspective. And I think being able to also tie in some of that personal experience is really important. And so then I try to have people on sharing their personal stories as well. And then I share some of my personal experiences. But yeah, it's really just meant to be kind of a place for people to get answers to all of those questions. And I ask just a million different questions. And like you said, one of our first episodes was about non-monogamy and kind of like having those conversations and asking from I think for me, like at this point, I've had a lot of experience in this space and, it's been 6 years, so I've learned a ton, but trying to really peel it back to the basics. So speaking to the person who has never even considered non-monogamy, who would look at it and be like, oh my gosh, that's cheating. That's just an excuse to like whatever. People who may have a lot of, either just fearful based views or judgmental views. But maybe you still are curious and they want to listen and they want to know. So I'm trying to kind of provide a place for them to open up their minds and just see that it's okay to like be curious. It doesn't mean you have to do something. It doesn't mean you have to fully embrace this different, way of living, but you can be curious about it and you can learn about it. And then you're coming from a place of knowledge, which I think gives people more power to make decisions that do align with what they want, or to even realize like, hey, I had never thought about that, but maybe that is something that would be interesting in my life. And then I'll try to ask the questions of like, all right, if you want to dip your toe, how do you dip your toe? How do you just kind of get started, or just, or normalize things, normalizing all of these insecurities that we have.
Yeah. And I think I love the title, okay, because, and I think the title is really representative of like where we're at right now, where people are finally like, it's been, years and years and years of asking for a friend. And then you kind of like literally cross that out and it's like, no, I'm asking for my fucking self, And so
Yeah.
I think that's like where we just arrived at in pop culture and in in the world. And I think that that's really cool that you're doing a podcast that is in the title has that concept. And then you just said, you sort of ask the questions for the listener. And that's something that I do. There's a lot of similarities between you and I, actually. And something I do is I'm like, okay, I'm going to ask my weird idiosyncratic questions, but I'm also going to ask like a volley of really dumb fucking questions
Yes.
because there are no dumb questions,
Yeah.
but there's questions that I probably wouldn't ask, but the audience, they're not where I'm at. So
Exactly.
I'm totally willing to jump on the bomb over and over again and take that and whatever. It's for a good show. So that being said, how long have you been doing your podcast, and what was it like to start? Were you nervous to start it?
Good question. So I wasn't nervous to start it. I have an extremely high risk tolerance. So unfortunately, in some ways, I'm really not that scared of starting things and trying things. Like, I probably should be a little bit, but if I was, I probably wouldn't be doing what I'm doing. So, I'm very much kind of like, whatever, like, we'll see what happens. Even with moving, like I've moved, I lived in New York for a while. I lived in San Francisco, and I live in San Diego. I'm just like, nothing's permanent, like if it's not working out, it's not working out, and we can go from there. I don't know. Maybe it's not the best, but I personally have I'm just kind of like, whatever, I'll try it and see how it goes. So with the podcast, I was really excited about it, and I wasn't really nervous about it. I think that what I was nervous about probably is more so, with social media, I guess Instagram specifically, or even now like kind of trying to get into TikTok a little bit, is like sharing more of myself, like my face, my personality, my identity. It's like running Taboo. I was kind of the face behind the brand. I didn't really put myself like front and center. But I think I learned over time that people want to kind of connect with a real person. And I think especially with a podcast, people have to connect with the host to some degree. I mean, it depends on the podcast, not always, but I thought that it would be meaningful, and also to show like, if this is for myself, I kind of have to be a part of this. So to answer your question, how long has it been? I started the podcast last year, but then I took a year off after publishing the first few episodes, just because life, I kind of got overwhelmed with other things and just kind of needed a little bit of a break from Taboo in general, actually. And so I just resurfaced it like this spring, and have just been starting to like create consistent episodes and, put out content and be on Instagram. So that's been a lot of fun. And yeah, I would say the scary part is more so just kind of putting myself out there, and even trying to toe the line of like, how much do I want to share? Like, is it about me? Is it actually, or it's about the listener? So, but I know that maybe they relate with some of my experiences. So trying to figure out like, what's the right balance, and what do I need to be sharing, and what do I keep private?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, because I started this show in February. I launched it, and I had no intention of just being like, other than just being like the somewhat chaotic, party boy host, right? That's it. That's all y'all get. But now, the thing that happened, and I would say within the first 10 episodes is, you know, I always ask listeners to drop a DM if they hate it, if they like it, whatever, drop a comment. And all of the DMs that I get are about me, my personal life. And, you know, in the first 10 episodes, I will say, you can't help it sometimes. Like, there was stuff from my past that kept resurfacing with guests, and, you know, I'm not afraid to share anything, but now I'm at this place where I'm doing these fucking awesome episodes with people like you who like give a shit and care and are smart and like are killing it on their own. And I'm bringing them into my show and doing the thing. And people love that. But they're like, they also want to know, what's my dating life like? How do I feel about these issues? And so now I'm like, same place you are. I'm like, I don't mind sharing, but like, at what point is it, where's the line? Should I cross it? And you know, everyone's like, are you going to do solo episodes? You talk about your life. And I'm like, I don't know, maybe next season. We'll find out. Just stay tuned. So that's a very interesting point.
What are your hesitations, I guess, if any? Or it sounds like there are some.
Yeah, I mean, that's a amazing question. You know, hesitation. So I don't mind talking about anything, but I think, at what point does that then take over the show? You know, at what point does that become more than, you know, and I'll give you a terrible example because I'm good at those, but Batman Begins, right? They rebooted the Batman franchise, and it was like, oh my God, we finally got Batman back. It's a serious thing. It's like dark and brooding and yes and whatever. And then like Katie Holmes starts dating Tom Cruise. And so they're showing up on a motorcycle and all the cameras go over here. And it's like focused on this wild, wacky relationship and not the content of whatever. Like, again, I'm a Batman fan. Terrible, terrible example. But I feel like, at what point does my circus overtake the meaning? So, because my life is kind of a circus. So, yeah. And, you know, I'm cool. Like, I'm like going on Facebook and dropping shit about like, oh, this episode's about orgies and orgasms and cum, and like, fine, cool, whatever. And I would do that talking about myself too, but I just have a feeling, you know, is yours, is that similar to yours or not at all? Is it like, are you just like hesitant to share because it's yours and it's personal, or?
Yeah, I mean, I hear what you're saying. If what you're saying is kind of, it becomes, in your mind at least, it becomes maybe a different podcast to some extent. Like, the goal, you set out to do one thing, or you set out to have a specific set of conversations, but then if it's turning into like what's your life, then maybe you see that as a different type of podcast or a different type of conversation that you didn't set out to have, even if that seems to be something that your listeners want. And like, I think that's kind of and that's what I'd be curious from like your perspective of that balance between, you know, if at the end of the day, it's like, what is the mission behind your podcast? What did you set out to do? And then there's like, what did you envision it as? So like, it's personally fulfilling maybe for you to, or like interesting to talk to people and to talk and learn from them, or to like see what their life stories are. But then, and maybe it's not as exciting or interesting to you to just talk about yourself. So then it's like, okay, what do I want to get out of this? But then also, what are listeners getting out of this? And if the goal is for listeners to get, you know, XYZ out of it, then maybe talking more about yourself is the route to go, or having that mix where you have the solo episodes and then having the episodes where you bring people in and see what people listen to more. But then also you have to determine like, what's your capacity to even do all that. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah. And, you know, you're a great person to talk to about it because you're going through the, you know, kind of that same decision making. And I would say for me, and this is nothing new, but to the listeners or in the audience, like, I've lived kind of a fucking wild life and done a lot of wild shit. And I think there's pieces of my past that would immediately overtake, like, for instance, and I'm not going to name names. I've never talked about it on the show, but I will with you a little bit right now. But like, in my past, I had like a thing with someone who is now insanely famous, like God level, famous. And I know if that comes out, and people in my hometown know all about it, and there's pictures and all of this bullshit, right? But if that comes out on the podcast, that is all anyone's going to know me for, and all anyone's going to want to talk about.
Well,
So
now it's all anyone's going to ask you about.
You guys can ask all you want. So whatever, ask away, hit the DMs, guys, hit the comments. So like whatever. So that's something that I think, again, I don't mind, but at what point is it like, hey, I've got this gorgeous episode. It's about shame and this and that. And it's like, well, no, I want to know about, it's like, oh God,
Yeah. I mean, sometimes I think I've learned this, especially in the sex space. I do think that there's something to be said for hooking people in with something that they didn't expect and then hitting them with the knowledge, like they came for the salacious, kind of exciting gossip or whatever, or to hear about your life. And then you hook them and reel them in, and then they're actually learning something from listening. And so I think that can be a very true thing that people do and especially because not everybody, I mean, it's just to go back to kind of our original conversation. Sex is everywhere. It's literally in everything. It's in every advertisement. It's just underlying everything. It's underlying, honestly, most of our interactions with people. There's just such a common thread of sex. And yet at the same time, there's this puritanical society that tells us we shouldn't talk about it. And that tells us that if we behave in a certain way, we're so wrong and, only seeking pleasure or whatever. But sex is everywhere. It's literally everything. And that sex does sell, right? Sex sells. It's just the truth. So people may not be enticed by something that is here, come learn about this, or sex education, or, whatever, but they are hooked about some story. And then you know what I mean? So it's kind of I think that's okay. But yeah, I guess it's just kind of finding what feels right for you. But
Sure.
I don't really know what that was, but those are my feelings.
Yeah. I mean, and I'm like a walking contradiction because I say that, but then I know exactly what you just said. Like, oh, that would be great to share on the show because that would do whatever. But I'm like, I say one thing and then I kind of I'm thinking the opposite. So I'm with you on that. I know it would be great for listening and people hearing those stories, and because there's a lot of stories like that are just totally weird and wild and crazy, and they all revolve around sex and relationships. And I have a podcast, and it's a baby podcast. It's 6 months old, so
yeah,
who knows where this road is
where it's going.
It's probably going to get bumpy, but hey, it's a podcast. And watch this transition, right? Watch this segue.
Snap.
You have a sex and relationships podcast. Obviously, we've been talking about it, and we've been talking about things in your personal life. So, just a slam dunk of a transition, right? What has changed in your life personally because you have a sex and relationships podcast?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And actually, I had a question for you, and I'll ask it after if I can remember.
Totally.
I'm not really my brain is always
It's okay.
going different directions. So, okay, let me answer your question. What has changed in my life? Oh man, a lot has changed in my life. I think that number one, I'm so comfortable talking about. Well, okay, I'm comfortable talking about sex. And I talk about it all the time, obviously. And I'm comfortable, talking to my friends or a lot of people now will reach out to me, random people from high school that I haven't spoken to in years, who will follow the podcast, which is kind of funny, but also really cool. And definitely wow, that's pretty amazing. And probably they, need it because we clearly had a similar upbringing or background. But at the same time, I think there's this weird thing happening where there's my work, which is, sex and relationships, and also sort of the, what's the intellectualizing sex and relationships in a way that I think bleeds into my personal life. So it's almost I'm maybe too much seeing things like, kind of like, where does that end and where does like my real life begin in a way? And I don't really know how to describe it for anyone who's not in this space. And I've tried to talk to other people who are about it and kind of like having that balance of, your work life and your real life. And I also think there's people who may have assumptions about me, like based on the work that I do, and which is honestly kind of a lot of the time wrong, because the reason I started it was because I was so uncomfortable, not because I was actually very, open. It was the opposite. And so I think that, yeah, navigating that and navigating like sex and relationships in my own life. But I would say a lot of the benefits are like, I definitely used to struggle with, like, for example, pain during sex, and I had what is called vaginismus. And so that's something that, I really struggled with. I couldn't physically have sex, especially after the experience that I had with sexual trauma. And that has really evolved. That's really changed with having so much more information and just feeling so much more comfortable and being able to navigate it, learning how to talk about it, all those things. That's been like a huge, huge change and burden lifted in my life. And just feeling more, comfortable in relationships, being more vocal and communicative. I think that I used to be very, very, very private, and that is changing over time. I think I'm more vulnerable and like candid now and opening up with people. And it depends, but I definitely think that's changed. I'm just very like more of an open book now. So that's been kind of a nice change, but it's still something I'm getting used to.
Yeah, well, the fascinating thing that you said was where's the line? Like, where does my work stop as a podcast host, as a owner, founder of a company based in sexual health and wellness? Where does that stop and where do I begin? Like, that's a huge, I mean, I like, again, just have this little baby sex podcast, and I haven't reconciled the line, and that's fine, whatever. But has there been a moment for you where you're like doing something, you're out in public or you're with friends, and you just feel like people are maybe looking at you or asking you questions that are different than they maybe would have before you had a podcast? Like, and then you have that moment where it's like, oh shit, like I'm a sex podcast host.
Yeah, 100%. I think so many people are coming out of the woodwork, like asking me questions or sharing their stories with me, which is actually kind of great. Although sometimes I'm like, what? Even my own grandma, I've been sharing this recently, that she, has now talked to me openly about like her buying sex toys and stuff. And I feel like that would have never, ever, ever come up. And I love it that she is comfortable like sharing that with me, and I think that's incredible. And I think you can open up so many new lanes of conversation that people would find, like what, or people cringe when they think about, their parents having sex or this or that. And I think, yeah, I've definitely had a lot of more people, friends who will reach out to me, friends of friends, where like someone will be like, hey, to a friend of mine, like, can you ask Mia about this, or has Mia used this? Because, which is awesome. I think that's really great. I do think sometimes it's a little bit like, I don't know, like, and what I try to remind people, and I'm getting more comfortable with this as I've gained more knowledge, is like, I always used to caveat, I'm not the expert. Like, I'm not a therapist. I'm not an educator. I don't actually have a background. At this point, I've learned so much, but it's still not my professional background. And I think some people are like, oh, that's imposter syndrome. Like, you've been, you have been in this field for so much time. But I don't know. I do like to say that I'm not an expert, and, I would try to point them in the direction of someone who is, or material, a book, an Instagram account, whatever, while also sharing my own personal opinion. But like, my opinion is just my opinion. And I think I've always been like a good listener, and I think people have always felt comfortable sharing things with me more for whatever reason. I'm like, what? Why are you sharing that with me? But it's definitely heightened. It's definitely heightened since I started just doing Taboo, and like especially now with podcasts. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's like a thing that you don't really realize that is going to happen when you start a public sort of podcast or show. And you have a company too, so it's like double. But there's just something about being in front of the camera with this microphone and you're right in your mouth, right? It's like people just sort of end up like treating you just slightly different. And then when it's about sex, it's like really different, which is fine. I welcome that. It's happened to me like quite a bit actually already, and I'm like, oh shit, I wasn't even anticipating this. You had a question for me though. I'm going to remind you because you said
Yeah. Also, one thing you just said made me think of this, and I feel like it's maybe it's important to note, but I think that also to your earlier question about like, you know, the podcast being about me versus about like interviewing other people. I do think there's certain aspects of being a woman that make it a little bit trickier, or at least for me, because I know that women are, I know that I'm being sexualized to some degree in my interactions with people anyway, you know, specifically men. And when you add on, like, oh, yeah, I talk about sex and relationships all day, you know, that's just immediately even more so. And so I definitely am kind of like conscious of that and kind of like, okay, I still am like, a founder and like a business owner, and I want to be taken seriously. And so how much do I want to share about my personal life? Because I think it's really empowering for people, and like it makes people feel more comfortable when I'm open. But then if, you know, if a colleague hears this, is that making them judge me in some way? And they shouldn't. That's not my problem. But at the same time, it can become my problem if it becomes a problem in like where they're, you know, doubting my capabilities or something. And I have to be realistic about that, because as much as I would be like, that's so stupid and I wouldn't want to work with someone like that, the reality is like that's a lot of people. So I have to be like aware of that. And I think that that happens with like, yeah, now with interactions where I'm kind of like, do I even want to say that to like meeting somebody, you know, at first, or on a dating app or something? Like, do I really want to lead with that? Because I feel like that will just become my entire identity to them, you know?
so. Do you also feel then? Well, lots of things there, but one, if you're on a date with somebody, and you don't lead with, I'm a sex podcast host, I have a sexual wellness company. If you don't lead with that, do you think that then later it's like surprise?
Yeah, I think it's like, I guess I have to figure out, because of course in the end I wouldn't really want to date anybody who would be who would kind of like, but I also have to be I have to be aware of human nature. Like, I'm sorry, but if I say to a guy like, yeah, I have a sex podcast, I don't know, like I would just imagine where their brain is going. They could be the most respectful, amazing guy in the world, but that is probably where your brain's going. Maybe not, I don't know, but I would say in many cases. So um but at the same, and it is a part of who I am. It's a huge part of who I am. So I guess I shouldn't be like nervous to share it. And I guess, and also the more, you know, the way you describe it is going to have an impact. But I don't know. I don't know. Like, I guess, what do you think?
Well, is it in your online dating profile? Let me ask you that.
No.
Interesting. Very interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, here we are at this very fascinating conundrum of where does it end and where do I begin and what's going on, and it's a big fucking mess of whatever. And I think, to be honest, personally, I think that that's a great mess to have, because you're creating something with the show, you're creating something with the company. You're strong in who you are. You're self-aware, and it's like, I mean, you know, there's all sorts of problems that anyone can have in the world, and those are like great problems. I think that's how I feel about my show. It's like, this is me. Deal with it. Like, whatever it is in my online dating profile. Like, I threw it in there. I don't know. I had someone on the show that she added it to her profile, and her listeners went up and whatever. And I'm like, oh, cool. What a great idea. So I did that. And I did notice, you know, when I was using online dating apps for a short time that people like the majority of the like that got people to say like, oh, so if we go on a date, am I going to be on your podcast or that sort of thing? Or like one woman told me, everyone's just going to want to sleep with you now, no one's going to want to date you. And I'm like, okay, like what, so there's always commentary that comes with it. So that would be sort of my answer or contribution to the question that you asked. Because I think, what else can you do? And you kind of hinted at this early in this interview, but what else can you do than just like fucking dial in? Like, I'm a huge fan of just throttling down, like, let's be more of ourselves kind of a thing, right? Nothing but good things can come from that ultimately.
Yeah, and people respond to that, honestly. I think it gives them permission to do that in their own life or like be like, oh, this person, especially if they know you already. I think it kind of just is like, oh, I know her and I didn't know that. And now I feel like it's maybe it's not conscious, but subconsciously that's what's happening. So as for my question for you, I actually totally forgot what it was, but then I thought of a new question because I thought I do want to ask, some questions.
Yeah.
So why did you start your podcast? And then also like what conversations are the most interesting to you? Like, do you go into certain interviews thinking it's going to be about one thing and then you end up getting hooked on a certain part of it? And have you noticed a pattern with like where you tend to have conversations with someone where it's like, oh my gosh, I kind of want to keep talking about this?
Well, yeah, to the second one, this is happening right now. Like, it's a great conversation. We could probably go forever for another 2 hours or something, right? Because it is a really fun, intelligent, but also like there's like a good back and forth between you and I. And that's like, you know how great that is. You're a podcaster. Like, it's the fucking best on every single level. And so I'll answer them backwards. So the second question, I'm kind of like really kind of picky about who I have on the show, and I will key in on certain things that I can really put my finger on, like, oh, this person's this person's this. Their voice doesn't sound like glass breaking, like, little, like, whatever. But then there's stuff I can't put my finger on, that I just know that their energy, their drive, their stories, it's like something I want to become part of my show. And so I'll have that, and I'll go through their online profiles, I'll do whatever, but I'm very careful not to, and this is just my own personal thing, I'm very careful not to over research. I'm very careful not to stress myself out with research. And I've got my phone in front of me that has maybe like 4 to 8 questions, and the good interviews, I only get to like the third question. And I'm only on the second one with you now. So that gives you an idea. So I like it to be fluid, and I like it to be fucking real, Why did I start Sex Party? I really wanted to start some shit, right? But in a way that's that was fun, and you could learn, and then you could also like hear some insane things where you're like 2 days later, like, I cannot believe the thing about the ping pong balls, or like whatever, right? Just like crazy shit. But at the same time, I think every episode is like a tightrope walk, because you get a little bit of the extreme, then you get a little bit of like total value. But every episode, the only thing that makes them alike is that you can expect both. A ton of value, a ton of like, oh wow, I don't feel so alone, I don't feel like, and that's me. Like, those are my hopes. But I started it because I really wanted to do something that I felt strongly about. And I feel really strongly about sex, about relationships. I think what you said earlier is correct. I say it all the time. Sex is everything, and it allows us to be able to talk about whatever the fuck we want. And so that was a powerful thing for me. And there was no other, I love movies and this, that, and the other thing, but it's like, how many fucking cinema cast, whatever. It's like, no, we're going to do something different. We're going to fucking go for it. And we're going to hold ourselves to that rock star bullshit, even if we don't feel like it. Like, and so again, I just like throttled down on it. So that's why I started it.
I love it. I know. I was like, I don't know what he's going to ask me about. I was a little nervous.
Yeah, and I think, that's a good point, because a lot of people tell me after the interview, like, I was really nervous for like the first 15 and then I felt cool, but like for 2 days I'm kind of nervous to talk to you, and I'm like, I get that and I really respect it. It's not something I do intentional. I just think the name of the show is Sex Party. It could be, you never know. And if you go watch some of the trailers and the episodes, which are all available on YouTube, you kind of are like, oh, this is fun, but like, holy shit, So there is always, every episode is a big question mark. And I just think that's so much fun,
Yeah, no, I love that. I think I'm trying to get better at doing the opposite of or actually not the opposite, of doing what you said, which is where I know that my brain goes in 20 million different directions and I can just go down a rabbit hole with someone for hours. So I try to stick to the script and try to stick to like, all right, these are the questions you need to ask. And then, I try to get as many as possible instead of letting it take that conversational instead of it becoming a conversation. So I think I'm going to start exploring like just doing, I also always have 2 guests. So that's like a balance as well.
Yeah.
But I think I'm trying to, in the future, have some more like one-on-one episodes where it can just be more of a conversation, because I think that will be more fun. And not that it's not fun. It is fun and I learned so much, but it's just like, it isn't really a conversation, which also limits me from kind of being myself fully and like having my personality come out in any way.
No, that's totally. And like, again, I'm chaotic, right? But I know how to get shit done, and like I use my chaos to my advantage, usually. And so a little bit of structure, having 6 questions just there that I'm never going to ask, that goes a long way. And so for me, that's just like my process. And I like doing that. I like having the bones of like a improvisation or just a normal conversation, because I'm a really fucking curious person. Yeah. And so, I want to know all of the stuff.
Wait, can I ask you one more thing? Oh, sorry. Go on.
Course. No, of course.
I didn't mean to cut you off.
I was done, actually. So,
I sensed that you were finishing, but I didn't know. Is your listenership, like, does it skew toward a gender, or is it balanced? Is it like, who's listening?
So it's like it's like 70-30 from the numbers I'm seeing. Like it's like 70-30 female, which I kind of figured it would be.
Yeah, I assumed that too.
Yeah, but it's like, when I was putting the show together, I mean, anybody can listen, obviously. But I definitely think that some of the stuff that I give a shit about skews more away from what, and not to trash anybody, but like what your traditional male would like, like Roe v. Wade, or like shit that was important to me. My mom raised me. I have a ton of sisters, and my grandmother's so it's like, yeah, I'm chaotic and fucking weird and crazy and all the things, but like at my core, I give a shit about things that I think most dudes are not talking about. And it was important to me that I didn't want to do like the blowjob show, like 2 fucking white heterosexual dudes talking about like how their blowjobs suck. And like, I'm not interested in that fucking bullshit. So like, give me some craziness, but give me some truth. And I think, again, I'm not trashing anyone. So if you're a male and you're listening, welcome. But I think women, people who identify as women, just care more.
So how do you, as like a man and as like knowing that, right? Because I think that's something I've always wanted to do, but I don't have access as far as like my gender, but I'll try to have on like certain guests or try to have a conversation, whatever. But and this has been important to me always. And I would say with Taboo's audience, like website wise, it's actually pretty 50-50, which is cool. But definitely with the podcast and like Instagram, it skews more toward women. And I guess I'm wondering, like, how do we bring in the men that don't care, or that they're not thinking about things this way, right? Because like that's kind of half the battle.
Yeah, and this is something that comes up a lot, not just on my show, but also I'm a guest on other people's podcasts, and I'm telling you right now, like, guest Dustin is far more like crazy and wild than host Dustin. And I really get into my personal shit because people want to know. And so the 3 or 4 podcasts that I've done, there's one coming out actually that I'm like, oh man, and it's a 2-parter and it's a doozy. Like, I haven't talked about any of
Ooh,
that. So
okay.
that's coming out. So like, I think, and it comes up in those interviews too, and everybody asks me, you're going to have men on the show, and I'm not opposed to it at all. So for me, to answer your question, I think my approach, again, this isn't solid, but spoiler alert, potentially, I think what I want to start doing is having a couple on the show, a man and a woman, to get in that way a little bit, because I think there are men that give a shit, clearly, right? But I also think that the majority of that type of person, male or female, I think it swings wildly male. I just think there's some people that are unreachable. But I
Mm.
think for me, my way in is probably gonna to interview a couple about whatever I interview a couple about, just have fun and torment them a little bit and see where that goes. So that's my approach, I think, coming up.
Okay, well, I'm excited for that. That's awesome. And I'm excited for this
Yeah.
2-part episode you just mentioned.
I think it's going to be great, but I also think, sometimes if you're talking publicly about things, you can leave names out and whatever, but like, you kind of like, if you mess with the past too much, the past is going to come looking for you. So we'll see. We'll see what happens.
Yeah, I always feel that way. I'm always like, is this just me being like self-important, thinking that like anybody's going
Hmm.
on some type of Google deep dive? But on the other hand, that is just people. Like, you say something and suddenly they are like on your LinkedIn, Instagram, like 5 years ago. They're looking to like
Yeah.
answer these questions in their own mind. So I definitely can resonate even with what you shared earlier, like similarly, where I've been like, I don't know that, like, if I share that, I just feel like it's going to invite questions. But then I'm like, but does anybody
Yeah.
care? But then maybe they do. I don't know. In a best case scenario, they care, I guess. But that's also worst case scenario.
I mean, true, but I think for me, because I bat that around too, but I think I just settled a long time ago on like, fuck it. Like, I care enough and I'm putting it out there. And if somebody
Yeah.
picks up on it, great. If they don't, and I don't really like looking into the past. I don't like reflecting. I don't like doing, I mean, whatever, but I'm human too. So it happens. And when people ask me questions on their show, I'm going to answer very truthfully. I don't want them to have to go in and edit things. I would never ask someone to do that. And so I'm just very, very truthful. But I'm a lot more unhinged, we'll say, on someone else's show, because I just feel like the freedom to be that way and be myself. So, I think we care far too much what people think, and it's hard because we're human. So, and that lends itself to sex, and it lends itself to relationships, and it's like, it's hard to not care at all. But if you can get like 80% I don't care, I think you're in a good spot. It's really hard to get there, but
Yeah.
I've
Most people
got,
aren't even close to 80. So
no, oh my
80 is
God.
something to strive for.
Totally. Okay, so in closing for this episode, I have a feeling we're going to be talking again soon. This is my intuition.
I hope
But
so. Sorry, I took over.
no, I love it. I absolutely love that. And you can ask me anything you want. So in closing, 2 things. One, if someone is looking to like get educated or wants help sorting things out or whatever, and they come to Taboo, what does that look like? How do they engage? And 2, I usually at this point would ask what advice you have for the listener. But I'm going to switch that up in this episode, because why not? Can you give me some advice as a baby sex and relationships podcast? Someone who has been doing it and is, been killing it since 2016 in that field. So yeah, that's 2 questions for you, if you can even remember the first one.
I'll do my best. Okay. So what can you expect on the Taboo website? So it's talktaboo.com, TABU. And I'm actually redoing the website, but basically how it's structured is that we have our articles. You can search any topic. We have courses and also a little like shop. So it's all external links, but it's kind of all the products that I've curated over the years that I think are great brands. They're, ethical and, good ingredients, depending on the type of product that it is, body safe, etc. And so I definitely am very thorough in my research on that and anything that we ever recommend. So basically it's a place where if you have a question, hopefully you can find an answer. And we're still working on getting more and more content every day and pointing you in the direction that's going to be helpful. And so that's the website. And then, just on social, it's all just about kind of opening up the conversation and getting some education. And then again, pointing you to experts. As far as advice, I would say I'm still definitely a baby podcaster myself, but I think that it sounds like everything you're doing, you're doing it quote unquote right, mostly in that I think you're being you. And I think that's the key to success. Like, especially in this space, people resonate with the person because sex is the most human thing that, kind of unites all of us. And I think when people can connect with a person and when they can feel like this gives them permission to be curious and ask questions or listen to you asking people questions or hear these wild stories that kind of spark something in them that they want to try, that's super powerful. And so it sounds like you're doing that. I would just say, listen to your intuition and, be open to trying the solo episodes or just experimenting and seeing what works for you. And because that's what also keeps you going. I mean, I've experienced burnout, and I think that that's when I'm not thinking about why I started this to begin with or what I want to do and what I want to, create. And when I'm creating content that I love, it's way more fun and people tend to respond well. So that's what I would say.
Well, thank you so much. Mia Davis, where can people find you? Where can people work with you?
Yeah, I mean, I would say go to the Asking for Myself Instagram page is the most me. I do have a personal Instagram, but it's not very interesting. And I mean, I don't know. Anyway, but yeah, it's Asking for Myself, asking with the number 4 myself, and you can listen to the podcast Asking for Myself or go to our website, which is talktaboo.com.
You're fucking awesome. Thank you so much for
so
being here with me on the show. Yeah, I look forward to actually listening to some more of your episodes because they're really well done. So thanks for being here. We will definitely be talking again soon. So
yes, please. I would love it. Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed talking to you.
Totally. Hey, I had a blast with that episode. I hope you guys did too. I want to say thank you to Mia Davis for being amazing and being on the show with me this week. Go check out all of her stuff, her podcast, Asking for Myself. Amazing, amazing podcast. Her company, Taboo, doing awesome things in the sexual health and wellness department because, I mean, let's be real, we could all use more sexual health and wellness. All of that is linked to this episode in the notes. Listen, guys, if you're loving guests like Mia, if you are loving Sex Party, if you want to profess that love, you want to show some appreciation, you don't have to do these things. If you do, it will definitely help the show grow into the monstrosity that it will become eventually. If you want to help that process along and you're listening on Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, Google, you can subscribe to the show. Most importantly, you can also leave a rating. You can leave a review. You can tell your friends. If you're watching on YouTube, hello. We good? If you're watching on YouTube, you can subscribe to the channel. You can leave a comment. You can like the video. These things really, really help. If you want to chat with me, you can reach out in the DMs on Instagram, Twitter too, but primarily Instagram. I'm sure some of you have questions after that episode. Fire away. Feel free. And as always, I will see you right back here next week.
Thanks for listening. The party continues next week. Click subscribe and let's make this a regular thing. Follow the show on Instagram and Twitter @SexPartyFM. Follow Dustin @Dustin Rybka.